So welcome back, everybody, to the final highlight of the conference on racial justice and finance. And we have now a panel, and Mike McKee from Bloomberg will moderate it. And we're very grateful for having these outstanding panel members with us. Big thank you to Raphael as well for helping us a lot to put this panel together. And Mike, the floor is yours, and you're in charge of managing the panel and keeping everything peaceful. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Marcus, very much. Good afternoon and welcome to the final panel of the day, Advancing Racial Justice Through Innovations in Finance. I am Michael McKee from Bloomberg News. Unfortunately, this is a virtual conference, so even though we are the last panel of the day, I can't promise you drinks at the reception afterwards. We're going to have to trust that you can take care of that on your own. We also don't have handy programs to reference our speakers, so let me introduce them to you now. Because we have so many, I'm going to ask that as I introduce you, you raise your hand or wave or something. I know that everybody's supposed to have the name on the bottom of their screen, but just in case people can't see that, to let everybody know who we are. Let me just start here with Mark Mason. He is the Chief Financial Officer of Citi. He is responsible for the financial management of the company and also spearheads Citi's expense management and Citi Ventures initiatives. He also served as CFO of Citi's Institutional Clients Group and was the executive responsible for Citi's comprehensive capital analysis and review submission process. And I can tell you that that is quite a job. As somebody who covers the Fed, I wish him luck with that. Janice Bowdler is president of JP Morgan and Chase Company Foundation, a global leader dedicated to driving inclusive economic growth in communities worldwide. She spent the last 2 decades advancing economic opportunities for families at risk of being left out of growing global prosperity. She began her career working to rejuvenate Cleveland's East Side neighborhoods, then moved to Washington, D.C., where she was an advocate for Latino families at Unidos USA, formerly the National Council of La Raza. She joined JMPC in 2013. Mark McCombe, Senior Managing Director, is the Chief Client Officer of BlackRock, overseeing all global client segments. In addition to these responsibilities, he's also accountable for driving growth in BlackRock's client businesses in the U.S. and Canada. Mr. McCombe also serves as co-head of Global Client Portfolio Solutions, helping clients take a holistic approach to portfolio construction and asset allocation. Bill Bynum began his professional career in North Carolina by helping establish Self-Help, a pioneer in the development finance industry, and later he built the nationally recognized programs at the North Carolina Rural Economic Development Center. In 1994, Bill moved to Mississippi and became the founding CEO of Enterprise Corporation of the Delta, and in 1995 organized Hope Community Credit Union. He serves on the boards of the Aspen Institute, NAACP Legal Defense Fund, and previously chaired the Treasury Department's Community Development Advisory Board and Consumer Financial Protection Bureau Consumer Advisory Board. Marla Blow is Senior Vice President for Social Impact in North America at the Mastercard Center for Inclusive Growth, the company's philanthropic hub. She builds strategies, partnerships, and programs that advance the center's priorities to promote financial security, make economic development more inclusive, support the economic mobility of workers, and leverage the power of data for good. She most recently served as founder and CEO of FS Card Incorporated, a credit card venture designed to move small dollar loan customers into a more affordable product. Before that, she was part of an implementation team that stood up the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, where she served as assistant director for card and payment markets. All right, let's get started here, and it may be a little awkward because we have a lot of people on the panel, and so maybe we just go in order, and I don't know what that order is, but maybe I should just call on people because everybody's video is going to be a little different. And I'll call on you one by one because we're not going to do opening statements as such, but I'd like to set the stage by asking each of you to respond to the question. The racial justice protests this year have put a focus on what's being called institutional racism. How do you define that, and where do you see it in your industry? Janice, I saw you on there earlier, so I'll let you begin here.
Perhaps he's passing on a hot potato opening question here. I mean, to me, there's no question on defining institutional structural racism. This is a practice that follows our 400 years of race as a social construct in our country, and the role that institutions, whether that's our public sector, our corporate sector, and in this case, our financial institutions, have played in perpetuating inequality. And they've done that by having set policies, practices that have excluded over generations certain groups of people, predominantly Black people, but over our history, Indigenous people, Latinx people. And the perpetuation of that over time has been the groundwork for our current situation, where we have a dramatic divide in wealth and income equality in this country. And so for me, where I sit as an advocate in corporate clothing, running the JP Morgan Chase Foundation, I mean, we've taken a very forward lean here, and not just me as the person running the foundation, but at the very top, the words of our CEO, that we have a collective responsibility, I'm actually reading his words, to stand up and take a serious action to address centuries of structural racism. And it starts with financial institutions acknowledging our role, understanding that it's actually in our interest to dismantle structural racism. Structural racism creates a huge economic drag for us. McKinsey estimated that closing the racial wealth divide would produce a 4 to 6% increase in US GDP. We have an interest, but clearly we also as institutions have a moral obligation here. And I'm excited to see the way that corporations are really stepping up. I mean, perhaps we'll get, I'm sure we'll get into this in the panel, but certainly the Business Roundtable that many of us are part of last summer declared social purpose being as important to our shareholders as our profits. So we have to move into this direction. And the way that it starts is by acknowledging our history and taking intentional action to address and to repair the harm that's been caused.
Forgot I have to unmute myself here. Let me go to Mark McCombe next and ask you the same question. What is institutional racism to you, and how do you define it, and how do you see it in your industry?
Yeah, well, greetings from California, where for the first time in 2 or 3 weeks, we actually have blue sky. So it's been a tough time over here with COVID and then the wildfires. But thank you to Raphael Bostic and the whole team for inviting us to participate in this. It is an incredibly important topic, as you've laid out. As you can tell from my accent, I'm not from the US, married an American, but have had the privilege of traveling the world and seeing a little bit of different types of discrimination that are inbuilt into economies. And what I would say about institutional racism, here in the US, I mean, it's kind of historically been this silent affliction in corporate America. I say historically silent because I think the good news is it's now being spoken about. But for sure, it has created everything from dislocation to dissatisfaction through to disparity. And I think that when we talk about, whether it's bringing our whole self to work, whether it's really leveraging all of the skills that a particular country and an economy has, when you ask how does that affect our industry, I think as everyone who participates in financial services or as a fiduciary, it's really been a massive drag. And it's been a massive drag on economic growth, on prosperity, on wealth creation, but perhaps above all else is just in the forward progress of an economy and a society. And as somebody, as I say, who's worked in so many different countries and has seen both the positives and negatives of discrimination, I think it's absolutely time that this concept of institutional racism be put on the table, and that corporations across the country kind of look at themselves in the mirror and ask the tough questions about, have we done enough? The answer is always no, we have not done enough. So now's the time, I think, for everyone to be focused on, what are the key drivers to kind of dissipating this institutional racism and bringing to fruition really the full operating potential of companies, of individuals, of economies.
Let me move on now to Bill Bynum and ask you essentially the same question. Institutional racism, how do you define it, and where do you see it in your industry?
You know, as someone who has worked in the Deep South for nearly 4 decades, you know, it's hard to not see institutional racism as, unfortunately, part and parcel of the centuries-old history of America itself. I think many of you saw the article in The Atlantic that quantified the valuation of slaves in the mid-1800s as greater than the value of the railroads and manufacturing in the country. And I don't think we've done a lot to extract ourselves from that history where people of color are exploited, extracted from, communities of color have been extracted from. If you look at in the eve of the Civil War, and where the concentration of slaveholding was greatest, and you overlay that today with where communities have poverty that's been over 20%, not just for 3 decades, which is the federal definition of persistent poverty, but a half a century. They're the same areas, essentially, where you had greatest concentration of slaveholding and the greatest concentrations of wealth. And if you look in the financial system and the implications of financing on healthcare, on community facilities, on home ownership, on business, and these are places where you just do not have adequate access to affordable, responsible financial services. For my organization, you know, over 60% of the people who we bank did not have a banking account prior to becoming a shareholder, an account holder at Hope Credit Union, or they were relying on petty lenders. It's in the absence of adequate financial institutional racism, systemic discrimination. People have to unfortunately rely on higher costs financial services if they have access to financial services at all. And if you look at anything that is required to climb the economic ladder, whether it's a job, whether it's a home that builds wealth, whether it's, again, healthcare, a healthy a grocery store in a community, at some point that requires capital, financial services. And in many communities of color, those are woefully absent. And so, again, I don't think you can really talk about the current triple crisis, healthcare, economic, and racial crisis, without looking back at the centuries of experience and exploitation in communities of color. And I'm glad that we're having more conversations about this. And I think that hopefully these conversations can result in tangible progress in action.
Right, and Marla Blow, your views on this time?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I've been thinking about the framing of what is institutional racism, and I think in terms of how institutions are designed to function and how they've historically been designed to function has a big impact on whether in sort of being a component part of institutional racism. And in many respects, to echo a little bit of what Bill was talking about, the design of our fundamental economic system and the economic underpinning of our system hinges on an exploited class of labor. And our financial system has had, through the course of its history, a number of very specific design features, choices, bugs, whatever you want to call them, that are intentionally racist, effectively. And so, for example, redlining, which is not a theory or a rumor, right? There are literal maps with red lines on them that existed, and some of them still have them. I'm not saying that some of them still use them, but have them, that demonstrate where banking was to be provided. There's recourse and protection under the law has not been necessarily intended to apply equally, right? And literally from a vote being counted, right, and Black people being defined as 3/5 of a person, right? Like those are institutional decisions and design choices that add up to, and we can, I've given a couple of examples, but they are distributed, I'd say, fairly widely throughout society. A lot of those rules have been unwritten. Those practices have been discouraged, forbidden, trying to socialize away. But the effects are still very much with us. And so I love Janice's description of herself as an advocate in corporate clothing. And some of the statistics that she described, I think does a good job of illustrating this, right? And so if you think about, she talked about the opportunity for GDP expansion. There's also, though, the magnitude of the racial wealth gap. And I do want to, acknowledge, right, perhaps not in this audience, but in other audiences, when you say wealth, people think you're talking about rich people. And this is not about being rich, right? This is about having any kind of asset and any opportunity to amass assets. And that asset passed down from generation to generation, especially an asset like a house, where one of the things I'm sure this audience is very well versed in is the fact that a levered appreciating asset like a house has profound implications for what happens in terms of your wealth opportunity, your asset building opportunity. And the exclusion of Black people from the ability to attain home ownership because of inability to get mortgages means that inability to participate both in that building of an asset and in the levered appreciation of that asset for generations is an illustration both of institutional racism and the profound impact of institutional racism that has led to a 10x wealth gap, right? Where the average white family has a net worth of $170,000. The average Black family has the average net worth of $17,000.
I want to pose some more questions that we don't have to go in order and answer. Anybody can really sort of jump in. It's a little awkward on a virtual conference like this, but maybe if you raise your hand or something, we can recognize you next, or somebody can just talk louder than the other people. But the first question I'd like to go to afterwards sort of builds off of what Janice said and what Marla just acknowledged about Janice's thing and the idea of being an advocate in corporate clothing. Recently, there's been sort of a re-examination of the Milton Friedman dictum that the only responsibility of a company is to make money for its shareholders, seriously being questioned now. So apply that to racial justice. Is it a corporate responsibility to do something about this, or is it an opportunity? I know somebody will probably say it's both, but I'm just wondering, what do companies owe in this case, given that, not to paraphrase Mitt Romney, but that companies are people, and how do we think about this? Does somebody want to jump in?
Maybe I could take a crack at it first. I think it's actually, it's central to the whole discussion we're having today, which is, what kind of economy do we want to live in? What kind of society do we want to live in? And I think you pointed to, some of the institutional rules that have kind of existed around how capital flows in this country. And so even if you take something like the ERISA rules, which govern how money is invested on behalf of people, it has certain guidelines which actually don't reflect the realities of the world in which we're living today and the questions we're asking about things like institutionalized racism. And so I think it's incumbent upon companies to actually think about what it is that they stand for. We talk a lot about social purpose. Nobody has a sort of God-given license to operate in the US economy or the global economies. You have to earn that right. You have to earn the trust of people, and you have to earn the trust of the communities that you serve. So I think that it was mentioned earlier on about, it's not just about profit. Again, what does that mean? Is that a platitude or is it real? If it's real, then it requires an entire ecosystem shift. And I think this is the subject that we're grappling with, I think, at the moment, because it's not a switch that you just flick on and off. To actually think about what are the sort of components of companies that you want to invest in, and what is the nature of the profit that you generate and the nature of the contribution to society, shifts that whole traditional profit dynamic, Michael, that you mentioned at the start. So what we think is our responsibility in financial services, since this is very focused on financial services, is to some degree we're transmitters of capital, right? If you think about all of us on this panel, to some degree we're transmitters of capital, whether I'm giving a mortgage loan to somebody, whether I'm investing in a company on behalf of somebody, our job is to be those intermediary transmitters. And if we close our eyes to institutional racism in terms of actually being that transmission mechanism, that is exactly, I think, in the preamble that we all talked about, the institutionalized problem that we're facing. So we have to start to break down these barriers and actually say you're going to be judged on a lot more than just purely your profit. And, you know, we could spend hours talking about the big ESG topics. This is really right in the heart of S. And S is, I think, where increasingly, and certainly the horrors that we all saw on the television in the middle of the summer, I think, have just reinforced the fact that S is becoming one of the most critical drivers of a company, of its social purpose, and of its long-term strategic sustainability.
Let me ask Marla to follow up on that and sort of reframe it a little bit. Is this something that companies are embracing, are going to embrace as a responsibility, or do we still need the government to push them to do that?
Thank you for asking that. And Mark, thank you for offering that up. I think one of the most important drivers of whether companies can and will embrace that is actually not even the government. I would actually argue it's BlackRock, right? And so I would argue that the large asset management shops, the giants in the asset management industry, have the ability to really drive change in terms of what corporate leaders value. And I think most importantly, what corporate leaders measure and report on. And if corporate leaders are held to measure and report on the S component of what Mark was just talking about, I think we will see real change. And I think we will see that change live past the moment of outrage and vulnerability that comes with this pandemic and the racial reckoning and the act of police brutality that we are living through in this moment. But it has to come from the place where the incentive starts. And I think that incentive starts because the leaders of corporations are themselves shareholders and are personally very much enriched by the performance of that equity. And BlackRock and Fidelity and the big pension funds, as the big holders and big drivers of how that equity performs, has the ability to change that behavior because they are very responsive to their incentives. And so if the incentive is to maximize profit, and I think that was one of the questions in the chat here about the balance between the capitalist goal of maximizing profit. If profit is the only thing you measure, then that is what corporations through their leaders will deliver. If you measure some social outcomes as well, they will include those in their behavior, right? So I think it's important to recognize that corporations are still comprised of humans and a set of humans making collective sets of decisions, and that can be influenced.
Bill, let me say—
Could I piggyback on?
Yeah, go ahead.
No, I will piggyback on that. I think a very important point that corporations are comprised of humans, and one of our basic instincts is survival. And I think it's, you know, my organization, we've always been data driven, and the data are very clear. And if you don't believe in, someone doesn't believe in climate change or doesn't believe in systemic, racism, then my points probably will fall on deaf ears, but it's hard to ignore the fact that the interests of an increasingly diverse country are aligned with corporations addressing these racial disparities. You can't sell stuff. You don't have a productive workforce if so significant portions of the population are on the outside of the economy, or outside, on the wrong side of health, on the wrong side of so many indicators of economic and social well-being. And, you know, Janice mentioned the work that the Business Roundtable has done on the purpose of a corporation, which speaks to the Friedman point that you made earlier. I think it's really encouraging to see more corporations stepping up and acknowledging that it is not just about shareholder financial return. It's about an economy that works for all Americans. But that certainly plays out very differently from corporation to corporation, and in places like the Alabama Black Belt and the Mississippi Delta and rural communities and inner city communities of color. And if you go into those communities and you see what traditional financial institutions do and what they don't do, and who they serve and who they don't serve, that has perpetuated so many of these gaps. I think that it's really incumbent on corporate leadership to continue to grapple with those questions, starting with looking around the table. Who's at the executive and the governance boards and key decision maker positions in these corporations? Who are the executives, and where are they getting data? I do think that the more diverse those seats are, those tables are, the more they're going to acknowledge that in a country that is becoming more diverse, they have to do business in a very different way. My organization was, my initial board was Rob Walton, son of Sam Walton, and the head of the electric utility, largest electric utility in this region. And they care about these issues, but they also recognize that you can't sell kilowatts if you don't have businesses in places where these people of color and underserved populations exist. You're not going to have a productive workforce. You know, Walmart can't sell stuff if people don't have the means to buy it. And so there's a symbiotic relationship that hopefully more people are grappling with, and we'll see that start to take hold, because again, Marla mentioned the wealth divide, but if you look at the wealth divide between not just Black families, households, and white households, but Black families with children and white families with children, it's not 10 to 1, it's 100 to 1. And again, in an increasingly diverse population, that is a recipe for disaster. We've got to address it.
Well, Janice, we've heard a lot of the arguments that Bill and Marla were making for a long time. And that's a problem, because we keep hearing the arguments that make a lot of sense, but they've been going on for a long time. So I'm wondering, in the wake of what's happened this summer, if you in your activities have seen a different kind of commitment, something that would suggest this is actually, those arguments are actually going to land and make a difference.
Yeah, I'm so glad that now a couple of times we've mentioned the Business Roundtable's new statement on the purpose of a corporation. And last year we were one of 181 companies that signed on to that and really put communities and employees on the same playing field, on the same level as shareholders. So you're right. What's the next step? How do you back that up? And particularly in the moment now where we have this massive racial reckoning in our country. So also, as part of the Business Roundtable, they stood up a committee of the board on racial equality earlier this summer. There are 4 subcommittees: equitable justice, education and workforce, healthcare, and finance. Jamie Dimon is chairing the finance subcommittee, which is squarely focused on how do we address the racial wealth divide. We've spent the summer months working on now into the fall, but developing what could be the set of collective actions of corporations. How do we look internally at our own practice and products? What might be some policies that we can support as corporations, and really step up and take the lead in addressing some of these issues? So I don't want to front run what will be an announcement to come probably in a few weeks, But that's at least that much is publicly available that we are working on that. And I know others on the panel are either part of that or have participated in some way. So I'm excited. I think that's a moment for us to step up and say, connect that intentionality piece and say, it's not just enough to say this really matters. Like, we've seen a lot of statements coming out showing support for Black communities, showing concern over the racial wealth divide, but how are we actually making change? Like, what will be the intentionality around product practice policy to start bending the curve on economic inequality? I think we've got a lot of work ahead of us, but I'm excited about a first step, and the fact that we're doing it in partnership with other corporations, because it's not going to be a problem that any one of our companies is going to solve on its own. But if we can start to build momentum around a trend, and then we can show the positive impact of our companies stepping forward in this way, my hope is that then others will follow as well.
Hey, Michael, could I just pile on to a point that was made by Bill, which I think is important, and it speaks to a lot of what is being discussed here today. You know, I'm fortunate. I chair an organization called Twigo, which some of you might have heard about. It's been going for 30 years to really try to you know, open the door to financial services to underrepresented minorities and get them into positions of leadership through various development programs. We had our virtual gala just the other day. I don't know if anyone had a chance to see it, but it was a tour de force from some pretty powerful speakers in terms of, you know, some of the issues that we're discussing today. But here's the point I'd like to make coming off Bill's earlier point. There is an issue that we face, which is that the pipe at the moment of getting people of color and different backgrounds into financial services has been sort of a structural impediment. And all of our organizations have historically had biases, whether conscious or unconscious, into the types of people that were brought into financial services, and then even more so the types of people who raised into positions of leadership. So I think one of the things that collectively we need to address as a community is really to think about ways in which things that, you know, we probably all took for granted, like, you know, apprenticeships, like, you know, shadowing people. These things have been cut back, you know, government cutbacks in terms of community programs, corporations looking to minimize costs have all cut into some of the things that probably helped all of us propel through the early part of our careers. And when I look at what we've achieved in Twigo and what our ambitions are, it's a drop in the bucket. And I think that all of us need to collectively pull together and think about the question of talent, and not just talent at the beginning of their careers, but people who actually say it's worth the slog. Like, you know, this question that we get often in our employee surveys is like, is there someone in the organization I can identify with? Is there somebody I can look at as a role model? And what I feel is, you know, we talk a lot about people being the company and the company being people, but unless we change that at the grassroots level, we're very proud this year that in our US population that we've managed to get, you know, over 50% female into our grad analyst class, and something approaching 30% in you know, different minority backgrounds. And so we're really proud of the change, but that's only the start of it. And I think what we all need to be thinking about is broadening that pipe, so that then the question Bill asked, which is like, how do you look around the executive table and say, yes, I see now people I can identify with, I think is a massive component of solving this issue.
Michael, before you jump on, I just want to share with Mark. I was a Twigo fellow when I was in graduate school, and I guess I still am a Twigo fellow. Once a Twigo fellow, always a Twigo fellow. But really appreciate you bringing that up and really working with that organization, because I so strongly believe in that work. And having been an entrepreneur prior to joining Mastercard, where I needed to raise capital, I now have an even more visceral appreciation for the importance of bringing more voices to the check writing side of the table. And that is where Twigo operates. So bravo.
All right. Well, I wanted to follow up on that with you, Marla, because not on the Twigo, but on the idea of getting more people of color into these industries. An economist, and economics has gone through a terrible period of self-introspection now with a great shortage of female economists. And I saw a statistic the other day about black female PhD candidates in economics, and there was something like 4 of them last year. And it's just a shocking number. But you also, where I want to go with this is, how do you get people interested in some of these careers, or get them at their level to think about even approaching a BlackRock? Obviously, BlackRock should do a job of reaching out as they do, but how do you make these job opportunities seem realistic to people who may not have any connection to this kind of industry?
Right. Yeah, I think that is a great foundational question about how we drive change in this space. And there's always the pipeline discussion about how do you get more people earlier in their educational experience to think about economics as a profession, right? There are lots of people of all walks of life that may never meet an economist in person, right? Like that idea, that entire construct is kind of rarefied air in a lot of instances. But I think part of it really does, I think, hinge on changing the path and changing where people see themselves. But there are also barriers to getting an entree into those paths, right, to even be in the consideration. So one of them is we use attainment of a 4-year degree as a proxy, right? It's a proxy for all kinds of things. It stands in for intelligence and drive and ability to just stick something out. But it also is overwhelmingly determined by your socioeconomic status on the way in to those programs. And so if there is a thing that might change the trajectory and might change whoever even contemplates becoming an economist, it starts with changing the requirement of a 4-year degree as the way in to even being able to consider it. And so are there other things that we can create or use or stand in for and serve as a shortcut, so that at Mastercard, at JP Morgan Chase, at BlackRock, at Hope Federal Credit Union, when we are looking at new hires, we are using other kinds of credentials to get people started. And then they can attain some of the credentialing along the path. But we don't typically think in those terms. And so I think, as Mark was talking about, the apprenticeship concept, and I think becoming an economist is very much sort of an apprenticeship kind of program, right? Studying with other economists, working with other economic and entities, I think is going to be a very hard task if we don't start changing some of those criteria to ever even be in the consideration set. The other thing that I will add, that I've talked about with people, and I usually talk about this colloquially, right, is we need to care intensely about who is helping influence and inform that. In the same way that I was saying, BlackRock has the ability to influence and inform corporate behavior. 80% of the public school teachers in the United States are white women. 80%. And so what white women do and what white women think and what white women say matters, right? Like, we have to actually really think about how we influence those points that have massive downstream implications. BlackRock has massive downstream implications. White women, by virtue of being the overwhelming majority of teachers in this country, have huge downstream or upstream, however you want to characterize it, implications of what they do and think. And that is where I think those interventions have to start.
Bill, I want to go ahead, Janice.
Yeah, I just I wanted to. I don't have my like emoji to follow on what Marla was saying, but I just really wanted to underscore her point about the 4-year credentialing, and I wanted to broaden it out a little bit. I mean, we were talking about, like, how do we get more economists? Important. I was shocked by that number of 4, but please don't quote me on those numbers. I'm not going to try to get an exact percentage. But
don't quote me either.
Yeah. Half our hires are technology hires or more, right? Like, at this point, JP Morgan Chase is predominantly a tech company. That's the way finance is going. So we have to think more expansively as well about who we're hiring and where we're recruiting from. So it's tech, it's cybersecurity, in addition to your traditional banking fields as different ports of entry into the financial system. And that opens up our hiring box, right? Like, we're not just looking for just, MBAs and future economists. We need to prime those pipelines. We want to think about diversity in those spaces, absolutely, with all the enabling conditions. But who's writing our algorithms that are making all of those decisions? We want to make sure that those spaces are also diverse and bring their lived experience to the table. And in terms of like building that out, I wanted to also add a point around, again, this, you'll hear me say this over and over, around intentionality. We set a goal of hiring more than 4,000 Black students over the next 5 years. We also have pushed really hard to remove barriers in our own industry to be able to hire more people that have had criminal backgrounds, to try to open up where we can recruit from. These things are really positive. I'm happy about these steps. We have to also, and our own next step is thinking about retention and mobility. Because when you were asking about how do we get people in, I think we find that we can often get people in, but can we retain our diverse talent? And are they getting promotion opportunities, or do they feel stuck and go elsewhere? We right now are going through that internal process to look at how can we improve our own retention and mobility, particularly as jobs change, right? And we want to think about future of work within our own institution.
Bill, let me let you follow up on this. I'll hereby ask, I'll just extrapolate from something that Janice just said. If they're going to hire 4,000 more Black people in the next few years, how do you link people in Mississippi to them? How do you convince people who may be unbanked that this is a career path? How does the company get to them and they get to the company?
I think that's an important question and point. I think it relates, though, to the comments that you were being made around economists. I think that people have to see those doors are open, that these opportunities are available to them. They are, whether it's an economist or whether it's access to banking service, there are opportunity gaps. And I think about a woman who in Bynum, Mississippi, a very small town in Mississippi Delta, 100 years old, had never made a banking, had never had a bank account, and did not have one until we took over the only bank in town, and she felt welcome. She felt comfortable enough after a century to actually go in and feel like a federally insured depository, someplace that was for her. And I think in the field of economics or in banking, the cultures have to change dramatically. And again, that starts at the top with the leadership. We brought Jay Powell, the chairman of the Fed, to the Mississippi Delta, to Bynum, and he spoke at a historically Black college and spoke to several of the students there. And I think, it was the first time a sitting chair of the Fed ever came to the Mississippi Delta. And so these people in college, for the first time, realized that this was a thing, that was not some concept that was not even real to them. He talked about how important it was that communities like the Delta, those in the Delta and people who lived there, were a part of the financial system that allowed him to use monetary policy to right-size the economy, because there were so many people on the outside looking in, it limits the tools at his disposal. I think when he and people like Raphael Bostic are carrying this message forward, in a more substantial way, that's critical. But one of the topics of this conversation was around innovations in the financial system, and I think the most significant innovation that could come from this convening is for the banking sector, for banking regulators, and the federal government to truly be inclusive in serving people in communities of color and start to be really serious about changing that culture. I don't. Again, you can't look at the data and honestly say that these communities have been served. I do think that I'm also not Pollyanna, and thinking that's going to happen overnight. I think we're seeing movement, but there are organizations like community development financial institutions. There are minority lending institutions. Some of the recommendations that are being considered by corporations and the Business Roundtable and others, I think, recognize, as we saw in the Paycheck Protection Program, how many small mom and pop businesses, how many entrepreneurs of color, how many anchor large institutions led by people of color could not get this tool that allows businesses to survive this economic crisis, but for minority depositories and for community development lenders. And so until banks culture shifts and those doors are more open and redlining doesn't persist, which it does continue to today, I think investing in and capitalizing these capillary institutions, as Robert Smith calls them, I think is really critical. 6 of 10 people who live in a neighborhood served by a black bank are people of color, compared to 6 out of 100 in a non-black lending institution. So just by proximity, you're going to hit the target more likely if you are one of these institutions, but they're woefully undercapitalized. And so I think that's a place where we can innovate and make a difference as well.
Let's talk about capital, and I'll turn to you, Mark, because you're the guy with all the money at BlackRock. It's one thing to bring people into the organization. It's another thing to get capital out. How has the concept of racial justice affected the way you think about asset allocation? And has it changed over the summer as we've seen this movement grow?
I think it's definitely changing. It comes from a very unfortunate starting point, and I think we've recognized that. One of the things I think that we all have to do as large financial institutions is actually take a look at our business model and kind of take a look at that, sort of look at ourselves in the mirror and ask the tough questions. And certainly we did that, and we absolutely felt like we needed to do more. So, many of the structural things that we've talked about throughout this panel have been around breaking down barriers and breaking down ways that things have been conducted historically. Let me give you an example. One of the problems in this country is that the transmission of capital to minority heavy census tracts, communities, undercapitalized communities, has completely broken down. And so if you look at the private market environment, by that I mean private equity, real estate, private credit and infrastructure, and then you look at the census tract and you do an alignment exercise, you can see that basically capital is not flowing to where it can have the biggest impact. We're a fiduciary, and our job is to manage on behalf of our clients the assets that they entrust us with. But that doesn't stop us breaking down these historical barriers and saying, actually, there are ways to do this differently. And this is not philanthropy, by the way, to just be very clear. This is capitalism, but it's capitalism through the lens of breaking down these racial barriers that exist. And so some of the things that we've been thinking about is, as we look through that ESG lens that I talked about, and we've, as a company, been very front-footed on things like climate change, how do we, it was mentioned earlier, forgive me for, I can't remember who exactly said it, but actually measuring the S part of ESG, we think is very important. So what we're trying to think about is, what are the metrics that would actually lead you to say, we're making progress in this direction? One of them, we believe, is in the design of products, so that really have a very, very clear focus on an outcome. We're looking at impact through the lens of getting money into minority-owned businesses and undercapitalized communities. And we think that through business as usual, if I can call it that, like doing the business that we are entrusted to do, but doing it by pushing down these barriers and getting capital where it needs to be, creates this virtuous circle where hopefully we're hoping we can lead and others will follow, because this is one where you want others to follow. If we can get that virtuous circle going where it's a bit back to the earlier conversation. More people are in financial services that know and understand these communities. They come from these communities and they understand how business gets done in these communities. If we can then take capital, and we haven't talked too much about it, but you think about most of what we are entrusted to manage is the retirements of, ordinary Americans. Like, this is people, teachers and firefighters and so forth, who we are entrusted to manage their money. And these folks want change as well. Like, they want to see us investing into these communities. So we believe there's a virtuous circle there that has been broken down historically, and we need to, put that back into place, get capital to where it can be most effective, and start to build the pipeline of businesses and business leaders saying, oh, I can see where I go now. Like, I start my small business here, I grow it, I employ people, I help a community. And then in the end, I start to sort of look at other sources of capital that may be coming from a sovereign wealth fund in Asia or something, that's ultimately where you want to get to, so that creation of capital and the velocity of money leads to economic growth, and it leads to breaking down some of these barriers we've been talking about today.
Marla, Mark is an investor, you're a credit allocator. How do the metrics change to allocate credit? We all know that you send in your income statement, et cetera, but that's not going to work in every case now. So what do you think? Where do we go with that?
Yeah, I think one of the real hard challenges is that credit and being credit worthy, what we deem credit worthy, is about stability. And for many Black people, life has been rendered unstable, right? It is the outcome, the designed outcome of the systems and structures in our society. And so I think that one of the really hard questions is our credit system really struggles to look through that. And as we bake in the history of this country into all the algorithms, the credit models, the background screens, the employment screening, all of that information that is informed by the destabilizing of some communities is deeply problematic. So I am very concerned about this. And I am encouraged by some of what I see, right? The use of alternative data, the use of transaction information has some validity there. But I do think that part of the challenge is there needs to be that underlying stability. So in some respects, if we can change our social structure, it will actually have as a follow-on effect a shift in eligibility and ability to qualify for credit because of the stabilizing factor that not being subjected to sort of overly harsh punishment. Or, I'll actually give you a real world example. A member of my family was recently at a public park. It was a state park. And it turns out that there are different laws inside of the state park than there are in the state. And she started a fire. And this is not a wildfire story. This is not headed towards California or anything like that. But in this particular park, you're not allowed to start any fire for any reason, which is different from being outside of that state park in a community, et cetera. So the park was being monitored. She got, confronted, and confronted sounds even harsher than it was. But she ultimately has been told that she's being charged with a felony, right? With felony potential destruction of property. There was no actual destruction of property. Potential, I was like, I don't even think that's a charge. But the point is, right, she's a relatively young Black woman that was doing something that she'd never even occurred to her was going to be a problem, and was only a problem because of the specific jurisdiction she was in, and is now worried that she might lose her job, right? If she gets charged with a felony and has to defend herself against that, she might lose her job. And that is the kind of sort of overly harsh, overly concerning, and destabilizing experience that Black people are still confronting and contending with. And that, as the underpinning of instability, makes it really hard to manage credit and makes it really hard to build up savings, because you have to fight back against a trumped up, overly ridiculous sort of charge of potential felony destruction. Like it's crazy, right? So it's a small example, but the illustration is much broader about what makes you eligible. And we do a lot of work to avoid making credit decisions on the basis of protected categories. But being in some of those protected categories is truly making your life much different. And that difference in experience is the thing that we have to try to figure out how to overcome. So changing the social structure to me is very much a part of it.
Let me ask as a follow-up though, how does MasterCard change its metrics to account for that?
Yeah. So one of the things that I would ascribe to this is I built a business to offer credit to the population that we are talking about, right? To find a way to offer traditional, revolving, unsecured credit at a reasonable price to this population. And I found it hard to build a business there, right? I found it hard to get the capital. So the same challenge that the individuals that we're talking about have in terms of getting access to credit, the businesses that would serve them also have challenges accessing capital. And so there's a funnel here that starts at a much higher level. And I think it's some of what Mark was talking about, right? There's massive aggregation of capital in certain places. Those aggregators of capital choose general partners. They choose agents to act on their behalf in investing that capital. And I think changing those agents is, to me, the most important part to changing all of it. And then companies like mine, and mine is driven by the proclivities of the founders. So you can have different kinds of proclivities when you have a broader set of founders, but you're not going to get that broader set of founders unless you have a broader set of potential general partners that might write a check to somebody like me. And so that, to me, it's all, again, this is all a part of a system. And I've teased people that, I can have full employment for life at the Center for Inclusive Growth, working on these problems at the ground floor, if we never bother to fix the things that start those problems up at the top, right, in the first place.
I want to ask both Bill and Janice, because they work in the banking industries. What role is there for regulators? Have regulators done what they can do? Do they create more problems? Can they help? What do you think? I'll start with you, Bill.
I probably have a different perspective of regulators than many of my peers. I have been advocating for stronger regulation around consumer protections. I chair the Consumer Finance Protection Bureau's board. I believe that a business should actually determine that someone can repay a loan before they extend that credit. So, and there was a lot of pushback, against qualified mortgages, or there's against the Dodd-Frank rule for gathering data around lending to minorities and women is being pushed back against, and that's being considered by examiners now. We've been a strong advocate for protections, fair housing protections, many of which are being rolled back. The Community Reinvestment Act, which incents and requires banks to invest in communities from where they extract profits, has been key to making sure that credit goes to underserved communities. And again, that's under fire. Longstanding doctrine that we thought were settled are unfortunately not settled. And so we are very clear that that appropriate smart regulation that protects vulnerable populations and drives capital into underserved communities is critical if we're going to balance the playing field and close these opportunity gaps. That said, all financial institutions are not equal. That you can't just have a big one big solution. It's got to be nuanced. And Marla mentioned the disparities in terms of who has access to credit, who can get access to credit as institutions. Her business that she started couldn't get access to capital. It's just like many minority institutions, small credit unions. And so they have different realities in terms of accessing capital, building their capital position, and staffing, and dealing with the complex regulatory environment. So nuance, appropriate regulation is important, but I do think that I don't see the problem as much in the regulators as it is in the institutions and their culture and their practices.
Janice, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, well, I think I agree with a lot of what Bill said. I mean, there's certainly, I don't think anybody would disagree that there's an important role for our regulators to play. And it's an expectation of ours as we work through a collaborative process with our partners on the BRT, that we're really forming a constructive and proactive policy agenda that we hope reflects a potential collaboration with advocacy, consumer advocacy, civil rights advocacy organizations that that want the same things, and we understand what might be some of the policy or regulatory barriers to kind of moving us forward on things like access to credit or opening up additional mortgage lending for homeowners. So I think we'll be doing more on that coming up, but no question that there's an important role to play. I think we don't want to wait for that either. I think building on what Bill was saying, there's a lot that we can be doing within our institutions right now. And so we want to kind of move forward on a both and. I think there are policy fixes that could open up more opportunity for us while starting with what we have and moving forward and making deeper commitments to communities.
All right, we've got about a half hour left. I want to start working in some audience questions. And if you do have questions, please use the Q&A feature. Some questions have come in through the chat feature, but go ahead and send us questions and I will pose them to the group. The first one is something that I had on my list as well, and I held off because I wanted to incorporate this question from one of our viewers today, and that's the basic question in terms of fiduciary duty. And Mark, you mentioned being a fiduciary. How do you reconcile your duty to maximize profit for your company or your investor with efforts to solve the problems of racial justice, reduce the wealth gap?
You know, it's a great question, and fiduciary sits at the very core of what we do. But fiduciary should not be used as an excuse. If we just think about the many issues that as investors we faced, not just over the past years, but historically, the role as a fiduciary, which is to look to generate sustainable returns and profit to your customers, is underpinned by also understanding the ecosystem in which you operate, the industries they're in, the regulatory environment, et cetera, et cetera. And, you know, we can point to something that probably all of us remember growing up, which was the great debate about tobacco. And, you know, was it the right thing to do to invest in tobacco stocks or not? And in the end, the debate becomes very focused, if you like, on questions above profit. And that's a little bit of what we talked about earlier on, but I like to use it as an example because I think it refocuses people's mind that these are not issues that nobody has sort of ever thought about before. We have confronted issues previously as a fiduciary where, you know, it's very easy to say now, well, you know, you gave up X% of return on your portfolio because these stocks actually performed in a certain way. So I take that as an example just to sort of anchor, if you like, the thought that when people say questions around sustainability and questions around institutional racism and addressing them, are they things that are in some ways in conflict with that profit motive and that fiduciary mindset? My answer to that is squarely no. It is the responsibility of a fiduciary to both engage and initiate debate and dialogue. So when a client comes to us and says, you know, go and invest in the Russell 1000 or the Russell 3000, like, that's an index that has a predefined set of stocks that include a number of things that we could debate again or fall into the category of things you want to invest into. That's not the point. The point is, as a fiduciary, you invest in it, but you engage with those companies, you engage with their leadership, with their strategy to try to understand how they're addressing these questions of your purpose, your impact in communities, your S component of ESG. And that informs your discussion with those owners of the capital owners, the capital allocators. And so just to bring it squarely back to the question of institutional racism and what we're going to do about it as an industry and as a company, it is to shine a light on the issue very brightly and actually to raise it to the point where people start to say, I want to look beyond. I want to look beyond the profit motive. And again, I'm mentioning it many times because I think it is important. Metrics are everything here. It's unfortunately too easy to get into subjectivity, and many of the investors that we work with, they want to see tangible data. So for sure, we have to find ways, and things like sort of SASB reporting and so forth, are ways in which we can start to actually address some of these issues. Are we going fast enough? No. Is there more for us to do? Absolutely. But at least I feel like we're shining a light on this. I mentioned unspoken at the beginning. Now I think it's spoken, and I think that hopefully will help us as we move forward. Let me give one final anecdote because I think this is a good one, and it transcends a little bit of the conversation today. Many of the public pension plan, the states have mandated targets on things like emerging brokers, working with emerging and women-owned brokers. And some years ago, we decided at BlackRock that not enough was being done in the industry, and we wanted to shine a light on the importance of diversification in the broker community, which traditionally was very, very undiverse. We instituted a program. We now work closely with both the public pension plans as well as the emerging broker community. And by the way, everyone used to say, oh, well, there's an inherent conflict between best execution and moving capital towards minority brokers, to which our answer was, that's wrong. You can absolutely achieve best execution. And the more you achieve best execution with minority brokers, guess what? The more the minority brokers flourish and they grow. And we now have an incredible business roundtable with the emerging broker community, over 260 billion on an annualized basis that goes into that community. And I feel really proud what we've done at BlackRock to be a leader, to shine a light on an issue and actually see tangible success coming out of that.
All right, that's the big guy's view. Bill, let me come down to your level. I'm sure you've had experiences with this. What do you say to bankers who say, you know, I'm not redlining, I'm not racist, I'm not prejudiced, but I got to protect my bottom line?
No, the data are the data, and you know those are hard to ignore. We've got perhaps more community development financial institutions, community banks in Mississippi than any other state. But when they have gotten that designation, which is a Treasury Department designation, because they happen to be in low-income communities. But if you look at their portfolios and you look at the fact that in Mississippi, a family that is making $30,000, a white family making $30,000 a year, is more likely to get approved for a mortgage than a black family making $150,000 a year. And you go to Arkansas, you got 1.2% of the Small Business Administration loans. The program that is designed to close these gaps are going to black entrepreneurs compared to a population of 15%. It's hard to square that with anything except systemic racism. Institutional culture that is not serving the communities where you exist. And so I point to the data, and I also think it's important to recognize just because Mark's generated X% return, I don't have to generate X plus. What is appropriate for my market? Is it enough to be sustainable, to generate to give a reasonable return to my shareholder, to operate in a responsible way? Because we saw during the financial crisis, when everyone was looking to compete with someone else to make these exploding arms, next thing you knew, we had portfolios of mortgages that were not based on sound underwriting, but based on profit maximization. And we unfortunately saw the results, and it drove us into what almost was another Great Depression. And so a lot of the things that we're seeing now during this pandemic and the disparities and the economic impact on communities of color are the result of institutions not adequately making resources available to an increasingly large part of the population, and it's made the entire country fragile. and vulnerable as a result.
Marla, let me come to you with this next question here. Are there platforms that share information on the impact of various diversity initiatives being undertaken by financial institutions? Are there places people can go to get institutional sort of knowledge about this? And this person also asks, what do you think has been the primary reason for underrepresentation? A very broad question.
Yeah, two big ones. So I have to say offhand, I'm not aware. There may be some scoring organizations out there or some reporting, and maybe some of the other members of the panel might be able to name off some. I'm not aware of any of those. But what I am aware of is one of the things that we've been thinking about and doing a lot of work on at Mastercard on an enterprise level is we've talked a lot about the pipeline, about retention and growth of employees, and changing some of the composition of the workforce and population in corporate America. But there's also where corporate America is the customer, right? So we all of our organizations have lots of professional services firms, bankers, I think Mark was just talking about this, legal services, consulting services, technology and talent that we buy. I think we're so accustomed to thinking about supply chain as the old supply chain in the auto industry sense, where there was this robust kind of minority supply chain and supplier structure. But thinking about purchasing now is to me another big opportunity. And there is the National Minority Supplier Organization or Association. I was recently on a panel actually with the woman that leads it. And they do a lot of tracking, and they do a lot of aggregating of organizations from which we can source other kinds of to source services and source talent and source all of the things that corporations need, from supplies and all the way down the chain, and broaden out who has the opportunity to sell to these large corporations. And those are, I think a lot of organizations think like, well, I'm a nonprofit, and in a nonprofit, we don't spend a lot of money or have a lot of money to spend. But nonprofits have auditors, right? Nonprofits have people that produce the marketing literature and collateral. All of those are opportunities for Black businesses to have it's an opportunity to have an opportunity, right? And that I think fundamentally is what is being asked. Is find a way for your organization, whether you're a financial institution or another kind of institution, and that includes nonprofits, it includes small businesses, it includes large businesses, to help drive this change by directing your dollars in different ways as well. And that feels like it has risen in visibility, and there's been more focus on it. So I'm excited and hopeful to see that come to life.
Janice, let me follow up with you and ask you if you have any advice on the idea of places people can go for expertise since you do this. And then let me throw in another question from the audience, and that is, if you're going to try to bring more people into the financial services industry, how do you get away from the financial industry history of basically looking for people from the Ivy League and the very top, very exclusionary schools?
Yeah, I think that's a really important one. We have an extensive recruiting relationship with a number of HBCUs and have historically Black colleges and universities, and have been growing those partnerships. But back to the conversation we were having earlier about the many points of entry into the firm, we also have a growing number of relationships with community colleges, trying to get away from just the Ivy Leagues. There are a number of places where top talent exists in this country, and we want to recruit from all of those places. So we've had a pretty big shake-up around our recruiting efforts and have been expanding those kinds of partnerships. There was a first, that was the second question you asked me, though. I don't know if I caught the first.
I was just asking as a follow-up to the question I put to Marla. Is there someplace people can look to find expertise on dealing with these issues, some sort of information hub?
On
on dealing with financial institutions and institutional racism?
I think there's so much out there. I'm struggling to figure out like the one place that that contains it all. But I would point to, in addition to what is likely a corporate responsibility webpage on all of our sites, as well as resources at the Business Roundtable, there also are a number of think tanks out there that have been doing really amazing work on this for years and years. Urban Institute, Urban Land Institute, New America. Extensive reporting around the racial wealth divide that I think is incredibly valuable. So there's a wealth of information out there. It's probably not contained on just one platform. But let me encourage people that while you go out to also look for research and data that is produced by diverse people who come from the communities, and look for those institutions as well. So I feel like I'll do a disservice if I start listing them all, but even when we start talking about the analytics of understanding the problem, we need to make sure that we're bringing diverse voices into that picture as well.
Right, did somebody else have a thought there? If not, I'll move on to a question for Mark here. Are there examples that you could point to of virtuous circles? You talked about targeting investments where marginalized areas have benefited from an infusion of capital.
There's a number of examples that we've looked at from a private equity point of view, and whether it's working with platforms on, providing sort of housing development finance, whether it's some of the small and medium-sized businesses, I think it was mentioned earlier, that have programs that specifically focus on the recruitment of ex-felons that have rehabilitation programs as part of their employment. We've looked at a few of those. I would say that the issue on the census tract, that was when I was talking a little bit earlier about that, that's something that we are looking at freshly. So when we did an analysis to sort of look back on where capital has been allocated, and we concluded that the capital was sort of coalescing around very, very specific types of companies. And I think the issue being that minority-owned companies were unusually disadvantaged when you looked, again, across the industry and across private equity. That was when we started to think that it isn't solely about the ownership, but it's also about the location of the company. And so that's when we started working on the census tract. As I say, this is very new, because I think what we're trying to say is that a little bit like the term ESG, it's very broad, or when people use the term women and minority-owned businesses, like, was that actually too broad? That actually when you look at minority-owned businesses, that gives you a very much more targeted outcome that you're looking for, that's very specifically aligned with a problem that you've identified from an investment point of view. So there are plenty of examples of where opportunity to access capital can be identified. But what we've found increasingly is that we need to marry that level of risk analysis on the individual company with actually the communities that they're serving. And that comes back full circle to the question that we raised earlier on about one's social purpose. Is it just about generating profit in the major centers, or is it about looking across some of the communities? And I think Bill mentioned this as well, about some of the communities where the access to capital has historically been stifled.
We
can get, both of you can talk. Marla, you first.
Okay. So I will highlight two examples for people to actually go and look at some specifics. The Cortex case in St. Louis, right? In St. Louis, there was movement out of the city core into the suburbs over the last 15 to 20 years. And that was all happening at the same time as during the rest of the country, there was actually return to the city core in many of the major cities around the country. And a group got together in St. Louis and developed something that they call the Cortex. And they built and they I think raised $29 million from local interests, from philanthropies, from economic development, from the city itself, and developed what's called Cortex. We are going to be highlighting that case. There's going to be some more talking about it. It's been a phenomenal success in terms of demonstrating development in concentric circles around it. And it has really changed the life and dynamism of that part of St. Louis. And it is actually highly multicultural, right? So there's sort of people from all walks of life, of all races, in a city that is generally very segregated. It has been a success on multiple levels. So I'd highlight that one. You can run a Google search for it and also keep your eyes peeled. We'll be talking about it more. And then probably my favorite example of an institution that is really doing some interesting work around this is to look at what the Heron Foundation is doing. And Heron is partnering with community groups to manage part of its endowment. And then ultimately, over time, as those community groups work together with Heron, ultimately Heron actually transitions ownership of that capital to the group, so that the group is actually responsible for that capital, makes independent decisions about it. Heron removes itself completely from the equation and is really about empowering local people to make local decisions about their communities, empowered with their own dollars to be able to apply to it. It is incredible to see that happening, and I have been following that development and really excited to see something like that take root. It's very early days, so there's still a lot to learn, but I highly suggest if you're interested in looking at where organizations are changing capital, those are two of the things that are, and where capital investment in communities has really paid off. I would definitely point to those two.
Janice, did you want to add something?
Yeah, I mean, I would just be remiss if I didn't mention our $200 million investment in the city of Detroit. I mean, when we first kicked off with our initial $100 million investment, it was 2014, and I think probably most people are familiar with the dire straits that Detroit was facing at that time, a city in bankruptcy and generally in decline. And when we first came in, I mean, first of all, I want to say the community of Detroit was just phenomenal, and they had a shared vision. They had an understanding of their challenges. They had a vision. What they needed were essentially investors in that vision. And I'm really proud of the work that we did to fuel that local vision. We had to press on a number of fronts when we first started. So supporting an overhaul of the workforce system, looking at how we were turning around neighborhoods. And you had single family homes that their as is and as complete appraisal were essentially the same. You could buy it out of the city's auction for $28,000. It would cost $100,000 to rehab it, bring it up, just to get it up to code. Again, not fancy, but just get it up to code. And the as complete appraisal would be $28,000. So the financing system was completely broken. You cannot use a traditional mortgage to finance that kind of single family property. Similar challenges if you walk down the line from small business to financial health. So when we first came in, philanthropy really had to play this fundamental role in remaking the market and helping to stabilize the market. Over the trajectory of our time, we saw market rate investments in the city tick up, home buyers tick up. And we haven't really talked about the enabling conditions that sometimes need to happen in order to allow for major capital investments. And this is an example where we really had to focus on those enabling conditions and get the ground game right. With our second 100 million, then we zeroed in specifically on how are we moving more Black families into the middle class. With a city that is 80% Black families made up less than a third of what would be considered middle class in the city. And so we focused squarely on that inequity. Now that we've got these sort of tackled some of the fundamental infrastructure, we want to make sure that those systems are built with those families in mind. So it's another example where I want to highlight the importance of listening to local residents, fueling their vision, focusing on where the market is broken, creating a set of enabling conditions, and then really fueling an equity agenda in place.
We have just a couple minutes left, so I'll give you each about a minute here or so. We did have one comment from somebody who is watching today that said all the panelists sound very encouraging, and they felt uplifted by the conversation. But the downside is we've heard all this for many years and heard people talking about attacking this for many years. And so let me start with Bill, and we'll work our way through everyone. Do you think this is really a turning point? Are we going to see changes? And if you're worried about it, how do we keep it going?
I've recently, in a conversation, called myself a masochistic optimist. And I really think that if you do this work, you've got to believe that your efforts are going to make a difference. But we can't ignore the realities and the significant challenges that we have that have been laid bare to us in recent months. When you work in a region where you've got a $40 per person philanthropic investment compared to $4,000 in the Bay Area, $3,000 in New York, and where you have a region where you don't have investments by the major banks, they go to the major markets where they get credit for Community Reinvestment Act, and the regulators give them rightfully credit for investing in underserved places in New York, in Detroit, and you're in a place like Mississippi, which is the blackest and the poorest place in the country, combined along with the Black Belt in Alabama and Louisiana, and those places are opportunity deserts. We've got to be more intentional. I think some of the strategies we've talked about today are very promising, but I do think the biggest innovation is that those who control the resources, banks significantly, regulators, foundations, wealthy individuals, look at their own interests and recognize that we can't leave a majority of the population in a growingly diverse America on the outside looking in. So I'm optimistic, but very, very realistic about the hills that we've got to climb.
Marla.
So I think Bill said that incredibly well, and it's a good call to action in there. The thing that keeps me hanging on in this moment is that I see participation, and I see voices at the table, and I see presence among parts of society that have never engaged on these kinds of questions before, right? I see the corporate sector. I mean, Mastercard, I just announced along with Mastercard yesterday, a $500 million commitment over the next 5 years to supporting Black communities. That's practically unthinkable, right? That a major corporation of this type would step up in that way. Or maybe I should say, corporations that aren't like radical ice cream cults like Ben and Jerry's, right? Like, so if you think about a major financial institution engaging and trying to find a way to meet this moment, and if you're looking for why it might be different this time, I would look there, right? And I would look at who is out in the streets protesting and saying, hey, this is not okay, right? And confront it with the horror of the fact that it takes almost 9 full minutes to take a human life. I think is, to see people react to that and react to it with very clear rejection of that as a reflection of who we are. I take some encouragement from that. And I see as diverse a group of people out there protesting as I've ever seen, right? I was driving through a part of Washington, D.C. Earlier this week. And I saw like a group of basically like elderly white people standing on the street, like holding signs that said Black Lives Matter, right? Like, I mean, I'm floored by that, right? So I do worry about a backlash, right? And that there are lots of other sentiments and lots of competing dynamics here. But this feels different. This feels like an opportunity. And it's one that we can hopefully bake into some parts of the fabric that make it harder to lose some of the ground that I hope we can gain from where we are. So I am encouraged.
Janice?
Yeah, I share the sentiments of my colleagues in terms of really encouraged. I think there's a lot of really important things happening in this moment, and I've referenced the work of the BRT and the coming announcements that we can expect in the next few weeks. But I want to stress that I think that's just the first step. And I think that it is critical that we not lose the momentum of this moment. It's hard to see it leaving the headline anytime soon, but eventually something else will come up. We can't lose momentum. I'm expecting that that our announcements, the things that we plan to share, really are first steps, a chance to continue the dialogue and continue to build on progress. We're not going to dismantle it overnight, the effects of 400 years of structural racism, but I think the momentum is moving in the right direction. And I don't know how to say that without sounding either a combination of naive or non-aspirational. It's neither of those. It's that we have to put one foot in front of the other. And I think that's what we're doing right now.
All right, I'll give the last word to you, Mark.
Gosh, thank you. Look, let's not kid ourselves. This is hard, but the question of how do you view it and how do you look forward? I mean, I've had more profound conversations with my kids over the summer. One in New York City, locked down for the whole of the beginning of the pandemic, and then determined to go out and protest after the murder of George Floyd. And I, as a father, you have the protective instincts, but at the same time, you encourage that spreading of their wings and that desire to be part of that movement. And I can tell you, as a father of 3 children, I've been so extraordinarily proud at the stance that they have taken and the leaning into this particular issue and the desire to keep that momentum going. So, I mean, I would simply finish by saying building society is not easy. If it was easy, we wouldn't be having to have these conversations. But I think we have to tackle, and to the point I think I made at the start about this being unspoken previously, the more we can speak about it, the more we can get it on the table, the more people engage and feel aligned around the outcome and incentivized to deliver. Because you know what, that's kind of how things have progressed and change has come about in the past. I've been blessed to watch change in many countries for the positive, and I am convinced that the movement we're seeing at the moment is different. It feels real, it feels tangible, and I don't think this is going backwards anytime soon.
All right, well, we hope you're right, and we all hope we can do whatever we can to keep this going. I'd like to thank everybody for joining us today on our panel: Bill Bynum, Janice Bowdler, Marla Blow, and of course Mark McCombe. Now we are done with our panels for the day, but I believe Marcus Brunemeyer has a few closing remarks. Marcus?
Thanks a lot, Mike. I think we'll come in briefly. Rafael, are you here?
Yes, I am.
Okay.
So first of all, I wanted to thank all the panelists. When I put this panel together, I couldn't have imagined it would work out as well as it has. Such a diverse group of people in terms of the background, industry, geography, perspectives. And to hear all the energy and the positivity, I think is quite interesting. For me, a couple things that stood out. One is how thoughtful this time is for everyone. I think we've heard businesses or accounts of businesses actually thinking hard about who are they, what does it mean to be a corporate citizen and have responsibility, and then how do you put that into action? And for those who would be cynical and say, yeah, we've heard all this before, I think we actually haven't heard it like this before. I echo sort of what Mark and Marla were saying about how the types of conversations we're having are quite different. And the commitment to actually act, I think, has been remarkable. And it really speaks to Janice's charge. We got to keep going. And I think for me, just the fact that we did this and had this conference and this conversation is a reflection of the possibilities moving forward. The challenges that we are facing today and trying to overcome, they didn't come up just in 3 years, right? This is years and years of reality and lived experience. It will take years to unwind, but we've got to think about how can we create momentum and movement moving forward. So I want to thank all of you. I want to thank everyone for sticking around so late on a Friday afternoon. But I do want to thank you, everyone, for being here. And for the last thing I just want to say is, as we think about how markets work, and we see these challenges, I think I would encourage everyone to ask the question, don't ask the question, why should we do this? But rather ask, why shouldn't we do this? Why not? And when you talk to people and they say we shouldn't do it or can't do it, when they say why they can't, that's the stuff we have to unpack and really understand. Because those are the issues, those are the beliefs, those are the conventional wisdoms that are preventing us from finding real progress. And if we can attack those and get those taken care of, I think there's a lot that can happen. So thank you very much. Marcus, I'll turn it back to you.
Thanks a lot. It's difficult to add more to these wise words. I just would like to thank all the panelists, Raphael, Mike, and all the people involved in organizing the conference. I would like to thank the whole team at the Atlanta Fed, Dave Altig and his people, and also the support at Princeton as well. Thanks to everybody, and I hope we can stay all in touch and make the world a better place. Thanks again. Talk to you soon. Bye-bye.